Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time. Now, you work with boards, executive, and founders to build world-changing fintech ventures. I love it. But what intrigued me the most was launching Tier 1 People. What on earth does Tier 1 People mean?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And when I was starting my business, well, way before I started it, actually, I think I'd had dreams of, having my own recruitment business probably back in 2010. And I was just, thinking of a name at the time. And I kind of came up with this name, Tier 1 Talent, because at the time, a lot of my clients who were doing strategy work were saying, can you get people from Tier 1 consultancies? And kind of that was the genesis of the idea. And then when I launched the business in 2016, it was kind of, you've then got to get domain names. And I was going to get the domain name Tier 1 Talent. And I thought, hang on a second, my business, it's actually about people, not talent. So why don't I go Tier 1 People? And look, it was the kind of reference was, kind of Tier 1 consultancies. It very much was more around, the people that we're going to find for our clients or the absolute, kind of top tier of the talent pool. And so, in a startup environment, if you look at some of the businesses that we've worked with and continue to work with, they actually demand and need access, to these people because they're going to be the ones that actually change, create world-changing businesses. So look, it's fairly elitist, I kind of confess, but if you're going to have a niche business, you have to kind of focus on doing one thing really well. And I think that was really where, if I was looking at longevity, regardless of whether you've got you're in a recession or times are good, you're always going to need the best people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is what propels your growth, whether it's to get out of, to do well within the recession and get out of a slump, or maintain a high presence within a strong market ecosystem that's existing already. So I guess firstly, you've got an amazing amount of LinkedIn followers, I think close to something like 20,000. You run a very well attuned or listened to podcast already. So well done on those amazing brand accolades. I think that's certainly something that people could aspire to. But I want to come more importantly onto your subject matter expertise, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but the area of fintech and how that has evolved.
Yeah, look, I've been involved certainly in Australia, probably from the early days. Launched my business just as the industry body was launching as well. There really wasn't a huge business opportunity back in 2016, but it's grown and become a huge standalone industry here in Oz. I was, rather than saying I had a crystal ball, I was some form of oracle. I just really looked at what was happening in the UK and the US, and Australia always has a lag period, and could see there was going to be a huge opportunity here. So yeah, look, that was the kind of thinking around focusing on fintech. I've been really fortunate getting in early to become well known in the space. I think respected as well, and I've built some fantastic relationships and friendships with just really, just truly incredible, inspiring people who have done amazing stuff. And I think that's the thing that I just really, whenever you have those tough days and you go, particularly in recruitment, right, it's champagne and razor blades. And whenever you have those tough days, it's kind of, that's one of the things that I look back to around gratitude as well. Like, where else would I get an opportunity to, be a trusted advisor to some of these amazing people?
Yeah, cool. So I guess you mentioned that Australia quite often lags behind in terms of the UK and the US markets from potentially a product perspective and launching and market readiness. I guess, I don't know, could you walk through or unpack that? Because I kind of feel that maybe in blockchain or the fintech space, that in terms of regulations and maybe awareness, we're quite maybe up the front in comparison.
It's a really good question, actually, Trisha. And one of Australia's strengths is actually from a product perspective. We're seen quite often as actually the kind of launch pad for innovation. So if you look, tap and go with your credit card,
Yeah.
that was launched in Australia, right? So there was kind of way more adoption of that. And Aussies, like the Australian kind of public have a real kind of tech obsession, right? We've got deep smartphone penetration. You look at businesses like Meta, Facebook, they'll often use Australia as a launch pad as well. So all of that is fantastic. I think where we lag behind is that, one is, I guess, from a kind of funding and access to capital perspective. And then the other is just that we're so isolated. If you look at London, it's epicenter of Europe, right? Huge economy. If you look at the US, right, it's a huge economy. If you look at Australia, we're like the size of Florida in terms of an economy. So
Yeah.
you'll quite often hear the phrase, bandied around, Australia is always punching above its weight when it comes to, innovation and fintech, and areas like blockchain where, we are, really kind of have pushed ahead and have got some amazing businesses that are world leading that have all been founded here in Oz. I think one of the challenges that we've just got right now, Trisha, is that Australia as a nation is kind of really obsessed around property and mining as their investment
Yep.
vehicles.
Yep.
We've only seen in the last decade a move towards starting to go into higher risk kind of investments like startups. I think one of the issues that we've got now, though, is with the economy and what's happening and the rising interest rates, risky assets and risky investments become less attractive because you can just stick your money in a bank and get 6-7% return. So I think there's some obvious headwinds there with just the lack of money, and these businesses need money to get, and innovation needs money to make things happen. Yeah. So we're I think we're in a and this all kind of ties really nicely into, I think, what we're going to be talking about more deeply today, which is the job market, because that is starting to change fairly significantly as well. And so people's approaches really need to change, as do their expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that ties in nicely, because at the end of the day, you have to source internationally or have a strong network to be able to then get your product off the floor if there's not a lot of capital, or within Australia itself, if you've got a poor network, then it's going to be it's much more difficult to get off the ground. So I think, by the way, even though we're digital, nothing better than physical handshakes to make these deals.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I think this is what you'll see, right? There's a lot of my network are flying all around the world, going to events in the US, Singapore, Amsterdam, London. It's they're kind of constantly on planes. And I think that's one of the other challenges, is just geographically where we are in Oz. We're fairly isolated, right? It's 24 hours to get anywhere. Whereas if you're in London, right, it's like often just a few hours on a plane. 5 hours you can be in New York, right? It's very, very different proposition to, in 5 hours I can be in Perth, right? It's the most isolated city, I think, in the Western Hemisphere.
I get it. I mean, I've done 8 years in Dubai, so I've been on a flight very easily to multiple countries and meet stakeholders. So 100%. And maybe this is why not as many people are willing to come this side of the world to invest this end. It's always us going there.
Yeah. Look, I think that has been, I've been pretty fortunate. One of the, I guess, things we've become known for is helping international businesses actually launch here in Australia. So companies like Revolut, really well known, probably one of the most successful fintech, in the world. And look, they've kind of just launched in New Zealand. They've been in Australia for four years now. They seem to be really committed to the region, which I think is fantastic. But we've also seen, a number of businesses retreat from the Australian market as well. So it is really, it's really difficult. And I think that those kinds of challenges, a lot of my network are in Dubai right now, right? Because they're making it really favorable, particularly for digital assets and blockchain technologies. They're making it really favorable for startup businesses to go and generate ideas and innovate there.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, centers being created, buildings specifically just for fintech ideas and creators to come together, which I guess at the end of the day, you know, when you're not so reliant on an oil and gas industry in the future, I mean, certainly it's not going anywhere, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But they need to diversify a little bit, obviously, to
Yeah.
increase population and therefore the economy in general. And these are the sorts of things that will get, you know, top caliber professionals to the region, which is, yeah, great idea. You touched on that you're obviously in recruitment and doing a little bit of headhunting. There goes my microphone. So how are you identifying talent? Because obviously when you're in this space and fintech, every man and his dog thinks they've got the best idea possible. But how do you
Yeah.
separate this?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, actually, Trisha. And I've had to completely rethink the way in which recruitment is done, right? And so if you think through the process, typically you get a job description. It's all based on competencies. You go out and find people that match that. You kind of usually go, you know, hey, well, who are the competitors? Let's go and find people doing the same job at the competitors, and that will give us comfort that that person can do the job. Challenge that you've got in fintech or startup environments is that you're often at the cutting edge of innovation. And so the kind of metaphor I like to use is, you know, you've got SpaceX going, you know, planning to go on a mission to Mars. Imagine Elon Musk puts up a job ad saying, you know, astronauts wanted, must have experience flying to Mars, right? You're not going to have anybody, right? And I think this is kind of a little bit similar to a fintech, right? Or a startup is you're doing things that nobody's done before. So to go and find this kind of latent talent pool, there's, you know, to my mind, there can't be a talent shortage when we've got 8 billion people on the planet who we can access. You can be anywhere in the world and you and I can have a conversation like this. And we can actually work and create things together, right? So, you know, for me, the thing around talent and skill shortage, I think, is an excuse for not actually rethinking and putting the work in to actually go back to first principles around hiring, right? And what really kind of frustrates me, Trisha, is the process that most of my clients have when it comes to product and customer. They do all of the stuff that if they did in hiring, they wouldn't have anywhere near the problems that they have, right? And so kind of what we've done is gone back to first principles and just asked some really rudimentary questions at the briefing stage around what's the big problem that this person has to solve.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if it doesn't get solved, what's the impact on the business? And just keep asking why, until we get to what the real problem is. And oftentimes what we found, Trisha, is that in 50% of the cases, there isn't a need to hire, right? There's probably somebody already in the business. The problem can be fixed within 3 months, and then you've hired someone and they're not required anymore. You know, you can you can outsource. There's all these different kind of ways that you can go about it. So that's kind of the first thing that we've done, is just to really kind of focus on first principles. And then what we've done is we've recognized how very different a startup business is to a corporate business. And if you look at the journey of a startup, and Uber is a really good example. If you cast your mind back, a few years ago, the founder and CEO left the business, and big cloud. There were huge cultural issues. Everybody was calling the guy a jerk. But what we seem to forget is that only 5 years previously, this guy was sitting in a bedroom with an idea. And 5 years later, he's got a 20, 30, 40,000 person business, right? That's worth $60 billion, where he's got regulators and like basically everybody's out for him and his board's out for him. And we're saying the guy's stressed and acting like a jerk, right? Like humans aren't capable of going on that journey and learning, right? And doing it kind of competently and successfully. They're going to make a lot of mistakes, right? And unfortunately, right, what we see is that, if you're in a corporate environment, typically, if you make a mistake, you can either hide it or blame somebody else.
Yeah. Or
You
someone
go
else
into a stock.
pieces.
Yeah, right. Or look, you kind of make around it costs $100,000. Who cares? We've just made $1 gazillion profit. You go into a startup, you make an error, right? And it costs 100 grand. Somebody's losing their job, probably you,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And if you try to hide that mistake or blame somebody else, that is just toxic for the culture. And so you kind of, and what we found is that actually in the data I've collected over 7 or 8 years now, 90% of people who move from a corporate, straight from a corporate into a startup without any experience previously in a startup, last less than 6 months.
Wow, this is really nice figures. Yeah. This is
So
globally or Australia specific?
this is just what I've looked at in Australia, right?
Okay.
So I don't know kind of how that transpires in other countries, but
That's still,
look, I mean, we're dealing with humans, right? And the reasons for that, ultimately when we've gone and we've done a deep dive and we've kind of interviewed founders and HR directors and executives, is that the common thread has always been that thing around accountability, right? Like they just weren't able to own and they weren't able to learn from their mistakes at
yeah.
the pace that we needed them to. And so it's a real kind of high pressure environment where you're moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour. You're being asked to do many things you've never had to do before. And so inevitably you're going to make mistakes. And so what we've recognized from that, Trisha, is that probably with the number one quality that we're looking for in people is their propensity to learn under pressure and to develop new skills. How accountable are they? How much do they care about the mission, right? How deep is it to them? And there's kind of common threads that we found within tier one people have been that the number one motivation is the mission, right? Like, what am I building? What impact is it going to have on the world? How does it make the world a better place? Can I feel proud and tell my family about it and my friends, right? That's the number one thing. The second thing is, do I get to build it with like-minded people, right? That are going to take me to the next level, that I'm going to be inspired by, that I'm going to learn from, that I'm going to develop. And this is why, interestingly, the kind of work from home debate, some of our most successful clients, they've got over 80% occupancy in the office on any given day. Even though they offer fully remote work and you can work from anywhere, people choose to be in the office because they get to build and they get to learn and be around people that they actually want to be around and that they're inspired by.
I'm in all favor of this, Dexter. Honestly, although work from home, it's great, but it's certainly, you excel when you're around others and you can bounce ideas off others. And in fact, conflict is also actually, or it can be beneficial. So sometimes these are the things that propel a growth mindset.
Yeah, you know what, right? I can hear the washing machine going, right? And I'm thinking, oh, it's a nice drying day. When I finish this, I'm gonna have to go and put the washing out. I was in the office yesterday and I had none of that, right? Even though I had other people in the office and they were talking and they were doing things and they were on phone calls, that was nowhere near as distracting as, oh, what am I going to make the kids for dinner tonight? Or, right? And when you're working from home, there's no delineation between your home life and your work life.
Yeah.
And so the two, to be able to focus, I've not met anybody yet who I've been able to find can do a job. And I think this is one of the other things about startups, right? You're hired to get results and outcomes.
Yep.
In a corporate, you're hired to perform a task. The majority of people, right? Kind of, if you're doing tasks, I think it's a lot easier to do it from home. If you're trying to make stuff happen, influence, get results, deliver, that's really difficult to do in isolation, sitting in a bedroom, kind of.
This is a really good analogy. I really like this. I haven't come across this approach.
Yeah. No, we were going to talk about job hunting. We've kind of gone off on a complete tangent.
That's okay. I told you at the start of the thing offline, we can see where this conversation goes. Because I think at the end of the day, these sort of natural conversations, this is where the ideas come from and flourish rather than, scripted points. But let's pivot. No worries at all. So I'm in the job market. I guess I've been in Dubai for a little bit. I've now returned to Australia and just navigating the Australian market and seeing what the differences are, which, by the way, that can be a whole nother podcast on itself.
Yeah.
And I guess we did touch on offline about the use of resumes and the, I believe, outdated tools that the existing recruitment or HR world are using to locate or find talent. And and potentially what could be a better option. So I would love to hear your thoughts. Obviously, I own a CV writing business. I don't believe that it's the best tool to use, but at the moment we've got no other choice.
Yeah, look, it's great to speak with another recruiter who's kind of really aligned with the the thinking. And I was talking to a client yesterday for my podcast, and they're an ex-fintech founder who, about the same time that I launched my business, launched a people performance management platform. And their approach to their business and what they're trying to get their clients to do from a performance management piece is exactly what we're trying to do to get our clients to do from a hiring perspective, which is what I talked about earlier, which is, that process of product development. You should apply that to the job, or kind of hiring and workforce, right? And think of the people that you're hiring as customers, right? And what is the journey that you expect those customers to go on? Now, to your point, Trisha, the journey that currently HR teams and internal recruitment teams expect candidates to go on is an absolute mess, right? It's diabolical, right?
100%.
Like absolutely diabolical,
100%.
right? And it kind of, there hasn't really been any innovation or evolution. We've literally just digitized processes that are over 100 years old, right? Like the greatest innovation that we've seen in the resume, which was developed by Leonardo da Vinci in 1482, is to PDF it, right? Like that's
it's disastrous.
able to email it, right, and upload it. That is some innovation in 600 years, right? So to me, the kind of where it's not evolved is that we're using, if Leonardo da Vinci was alive today, one of the greatest innovators in the history of humanity, would he be sending his resume and applying to applicant tracking systems and job ads? Absolutely no chance, right? He'd be using all of the media that we've got to promote our brands, right? And he'd be thinking through what are the ways, right? Because all he was trying to do was to communicate the work that he'd done and present examples, right? The only medium he had available to him at that time was pen and paper.
Yeah.
Right? The mediums that we've got available to us now are just, the potential is less, right?
Yeah. NFTs, everything. You can put, you can tokenize things.
And at the end of the day, right, like, I don't know about you, but I've been doing this, over 20 years. I started recruiting in the late 90s, and I am yet to see anybody who was hired purely on the strength of their resume. All the resume did was get them the opportunity to go and have a discussion with someone. Right. So what I say is, like, if you look at marketing, which business now, if you went to, you hired a head of marketing and they came in, you were interviewing them and you said, okay, what's your growth strategy? Well, why don't we do a brochure and we'll just send the brochure out to all the people on the database? You're not going to hire that person, right? When it comes to job searching, what you're going to do, I'm going to spend 3 months faffing around with my resume that nobody's going to read. And then I'm going to spend another 6 months applying to every job that I see online, along with another 1,000 people,
and
2,000 people,
pay someone to
and
write
pray, right?
But then globally, it's a stock standard. Why?
Yeah.
And how do we change or shape the industry to not accept? I mean, even LinkedIn, when it was launched, years ago, they still adopted it when they had a chance to remove the concept of it.
Yeah.
But it's still and mandatory on job application portals. You can't progress to the next level unless you uploaded something.
Yeah. And look, I think, what I'd like to talk about is maybe, cheats around the system, right? And if I look at, my network, 75% of my network will find their next job through a direct contact, not through a job application, right? Now, you might say, oh, well, they're executives. That's not necessarily the case, right? Like these people that I'm talking to, oftentimes, right, if they're on the job market, they'll say, I haven't got a resume. I haven't needed one for 15 years because I get all of my roles from people in my network, right? And they already know me, so they don't need a resume, right? Like, so I think with that, right, you have to kind of then take and say, okay, if we're looking at job hunting as a marketing exercise, right? Like, you're the product or the service. How are you going to get yourself in front of decision makers, right? And rather than kind of B2C marketing, I encourage people to think of it more as a B2B marketing exercise than B2C. What's the distinction between that? Well, you know that you've got Pareto's law around 80-20, so kind of 80% of your results comes from 20% of your network. I think when it comes to job hunting, I would change that to say 95-5. So 95% of the results are going to come from 5% of your network. Now, what you need to do is to look at your network and pick out who is that 5%. And the criteria that I would suggest that people, kind of get really clear on when they're identifying that is, first of all, is this person in a position where they could potentially hire me? And if they're not in the 5%. They might be able to help influence, you in the process. But if they can't make a decision to actually give you a job, then they're not in that 5%. The second one is, do they like me, right? Do they trust me, right? Like, are they going to feel comfortable going out to their network and advocating for me, right? Yeah. And then the third one is, how do I make it easy for them to say yes to help me, right? And so I'm going to start with that last point first. My default position when any stranger reaches out to me and asks me for a coffee is no. And the reason why is that coffee costs my business about $500 to $1,000 all in when I kind of work out, all of the impacts that it would have. And unless there's a really strong commercial reason to do that, my default is no.
Does that mean I owe you $500 for this coffee chat?
No, right? Here's why we're talking, right? You came to me with something that I perceived was valuable. You didn't ask me for anything. You offered me something, right?
Yeah.
I asked you a couple of questions. You said, oh, well, here's, to make sure it was going to be valuable for me and that we weren't going to waste time. That's right. And you answered those questions. And I was like, yeah, great, let's do it, right? So what you did was you kind of started off with a small request and then expanded on it. What I find is people kind of go out and it's like, here's my resume, I'm looking for a job. You're the 30th person to do that day. It's overwhelming, right? Like, so that person's probably worried about their own job and like, oh, now I've got to take on someone else's problems, right? So what you're doing is you're making it really difficult for them to say yes. What you need to do is make it easy for them to say yes, right? And that is usually a small request first, asking for 2 minutes of somebody's time. If you know them and they say no, they're going to feel like an absolute jerk. If you ask them for a coffee or lunch, they're not going to feel so bad about saying no because that's got a heavier cost to them, right? So they can kind of justify it. So I always kind of suggest that you start off with a small request. Oftentimes if you know that person, hey, I'm thinking about what's next in my career. You know me well enough to call bullshit and be able to, tell me what my strengths and weaknesses are. I've got a few ideas. I was hoping I could run by you. Have you got a couple of minutes to chat at some point over the next week, right? 90% of your network are going to say yes to that, right? Now, once you get the chat, they, oftentimes, and I did this when I launched my business, right? I kind of looked at this 95-5 and I looked and there was about 100 people who had done business with in the past who I thought might be potential clients of tier 1 people. And I wrote a simple email saying, hey, I've just started my own business. You know me well. I've got a few ideas of things that I think I can do differently, which will get better results for you and be cheaper. But I know you're the type of person that will call bullshit on me. Have you got a few minutes to chat and I can run those ideas by you, right? And I sent that email out to about 100 people, hoping that over 90 days, I might get 90 coffees, right? And in the first 2 weeks, I think I did something like 50 meetings, right? And pretty much every one of those people said, hey, forget a call. Let's catch up for lunch. Let's do a coffee. Great to hear you. Yeah, whatever we can do to help, right? And then they gave me feedback, right? And within 2 weeks, I'd sent out my first invoice. Now, I didn't go to them saying, I've just launched my own business. Have you got any jobs? I need work. I just asked them for advice. And there was a little kind of thing that I read on LinkedIn, maybe it's about a decade ago, and it's a really cool mantra for people to kind of consider when they're looking for a job. Ask for a job and you'll get advice. Ask for advice and you'll get a job. Right.
Yeah,
So
love it.
so look, when you take that approach, you can bypass the whole, thing of resumes. Even if that company's advertising, yeah, you might have to get in at the back end, but you're cutting out all of that ATS and the recruiter not understanding the nuance of your experience, not understanding really what the problem is that the hiring manager's got as well, because all they've got is a job spec. So once you kind of started that networking process, this is where the real compounding impact of it starts to take effect. So that 5%, who are really influential, at the end of that time when they've given you some advice, what they're going to say next to you is, hey, what I think you should do is X. Why don't I introduce you to this person who can potentially help? Now, that person is going to be somebody of influence who can potentially hire you, who is being encouraged to meet with you by somebody that they know and trust and that they rate extremely highly, who's saying, you got to meet this person, right?
That's right.
Now, if you can imagine, right, if you meet with 5 people who are all decision makers, who recommend 2 people, right, who then recommend another 2 people, right? You got like 25, 30 meetings, right, before with highly influential people who could potentially hire you,
Yep.
right? Or you could be spending most of your time applying to stuff online where the decision maker never gets to see your resume anyway,
Absolutely.
right? And then kind of get all frustrated and burnt out because it's so demoralizing to go
Absolutely.
through that process.
100%, because it's usually the junior HR that is running the job description through this software, not the
Yeah.
yeah.
And there's nothing on it that you can actually differentiate and say, hey, I can fix your problem, because
Yeah.
it's all just generic worldy, where, we're a unicorn, we're on a rocket ship, we're blah, blah, blah. Like, just tell me what you're trying to fix, right? And then I can tell you whether I've got the relevant experience or not.
Yeah. And I guess it would also saves applying for hundreds of jobs. Whereas if you have a focus and say, look, this is my top 10 or top 20 companies, who are the stakeholders in those target companies that I can, reach to it, and of course propose where I can add value. So I love it. Dexter, I don't know how on earth 40 minutes has gone, but I've got 2 minutes left of this recording before we're cut off. So I can send a new link, or we can leave it at part 2.
Why don't you just send me a new link, because we're in the flow, right? And so if you want to continue it, let's just do it.
Perfect. Sounds really good. I'll come back to you. Cool.
And you talked about creating value. And I think one of the big problems that people have is when they go through this process and they embark on, I'm sure you've coached thousands of people in their careers, right? And this kind of inflection point. And we're kind of, we get bogged down with these questions that don't really help us. And I always remember probably when I, kind of really got, really comfortable in life and comfortable with, being with my wife, was when the day that I realized that me trying to make her happy, I was never going to be happy, because as soon as I got her what she wanted, she would change her mind, right? And kind of, why I use this analogy is that, I think we do this all the time when we're job searching. We'll ask ourselves questions about what's going to make me happy, what's going to get me inspired, right? And it's like, the reality is nobody cares except you, right? Nobody's going to pay you X amount of thousands of dollars a year for what you want. They're paying you because you're solving a specific problem that they have, right? And I think we've lost sight of that, particularly over the last few years, where I think the job market has got way too weighted towards candidates and way less weighted around actually, delivering. And this is a kind of mutually beneficial contract where obligations are on both sides, and it's kind of in recruitment, right? There's nowhere to hide. If you don't deliver in 3 months, you're out the door, right? Like, it's just the kind of unspoken rule, right? Like, and that kind of harsh reality, kind of instills certain kind of disciplines and behaviors and approaches that you kind of then carry into life, that you carry into your own businesses. And I think, unfortunately, what I see a lot of people when it comes to job searching is it's all about them. and they're not thinking, again, using the product analogy, they're not thinking about who's the end user, who's the customer, right? And the customer in this instance is whoever's going to be employing you, right? And you have to be fixing a specific problem and need that they have. So I've found that one of the most empowering things that you can do as you're going through this process, and the people that you're talking to will give you some really good feedback as well, as like, what are the big problems that I solve? What am I as good at, if not better than anybody else in my peer group? What are the things where I can come in and I can, particularly in startups, right? Where can I come in and make an immediate impact? Now, once you kind of go through those questions, it's really quite empowering, because you then start to recognize, hey, look, these are my strengths, right? Whereas when somebody says, what are your strengths? You're like, oh, yeah, you put on the spot, right? Like you're your worst kind of critic or judge, right? So I find that process really kind of helps cement, one, identifying the problems that you solve, but then you can look and go, okay, who's got these problems? And to that point that you said, who are the top 20 businesses that I want to work with? Well, if none of them have got the problem that you solve, it's kind of, it's not going to be a really kind of fruitful exercise trying to engineer an opportunity with them. So it's really about getting clarity around, where you create an impact, make an impact, where you create value, what big problems you solve. And then the next thing I think is just kind of setting yourself like a little balance sheet, right? Of what are your achievements, and so, if you've implemented processes that have saved, $500,000 a year in costs, cool, right? But do what an accountant does and spread that out over 5 years, right? That's $2.5 million you've saved the business, right? And as you kind of look through and you take this approach, these things all add up, right?
Yep.
Now, can you imagine if somebody sent you an email or a LinkedIn message and you didn't know them, and they said, hey, Trisha, you don't know me. I've just lost my job. I'm looking for a job. Here's a resume. Or they said, hey, Trisha, yeah, I was reading about your business, and I think there's a way that I could save you $17 million cost over 5 years. And I've got a few ideas, right? Would you be interested in perhaps catching up, right? I
Yeah.
don't know many people who are going to say, no, thanks, I'm not interested, right? Unless you're doing lead gen or outsourcing, right? And you try, right? But if you're a genuine candidate who's
Yeah.
kind of reaching out to somebody and saying, hey, look, just wanted to share some ideas with you, there is nobody I'm aware of who is going to turn down that meeting. They might postpone it. They might say, hey, I'm busy right now. Can we chat some other time? Or could you speak to somebody else in the business? But you're going to get positive response nonetheless.
Yeah.
And this is where I think, as much as I'm really against resumes, and I'm actually really against resume writers, mainly because what I've seen is they've kind of created, this almost like pastiche of, just like very formulaic, vanilla kind of template driven resumes. I think when you get somebody who really understands the process like yourself and really kind of takes this marketing, and kind of is nuanced, that is really impactful, right? Like, and I think you have to make an impact with a resume, because we all know the 6-second rule. People are looking at where you're working now, where did you work previously, either yes, no, right? And it's as simple as that.
And just quickly, you mentioned you only want people from top tier consulting companies, and that's exactly what recruiters quite often do. I'm tasked for Accenture or whatever, the big four, and if they don't see the big four, that candidate's out the door without even looking at anything else.
And here's the cool thing, right? So when I look at the data and all the hires that we've made over the last 5-6 years, over 75% of those people didn't have what I would say was direct industry experience, right? So they weren't coming from a direct competitor. It wasn't like, right? And it was what they had was a blueprint for success. They solved the problem and they could demonstrate that.
Yeah.
Now, I had to go and do a lot of work around going and finding these people and using context and nuance and looking at, hey, well, who else has solved this problem? Where perhaps can I find them? How do I use my network? How do I use LinkedIn? How do I use all the tools available to me to go out and engage with these people and kind of get a conversation to happen? But the reality is, right, like it's exactly the same process. right? And I think if people can use, the things that I do to be really good at what I do, which is headhunting, and kind of bypass me out the system by, I do most of my kind of easy plumbing jobs by going on YouTube, right? It's fantastic. It's like, saves me like really thousands of dollars, right? Like, and it's stuff that, look, if it's a big job, of course, I'm not going to go on YouTube and try and do it, but fixing a tap, like simple stuff. And I think this is, there's just some simple things that people can do that reframe the approach, right? Reframe, what the whole relationship is, and then look at just and analyze what are the things that you're doing, and really how productive are they, and how efficient are they, and do they actually get results? And I think if you look at a job search as it is, right, and as it has been, Trisha, you have to say that 95% of the stuff that we do delivers very little kind of result, right?
Agree, absolutely. And I wonder, people want a quick fix, and I'm based off, my 8 years of experience from the UAE market. So, please, I don't know if it's transferable what I'm saying to the Australian, but quite often people just click apply or easy apply, up, just to try and get a job. And then I guess that also encourages on the backside or the flip side, a higher turnover rate, because they see something better and then they want the next bigger paycheck.
How many times have you rang somebody who's applied for a job, right, as a recruiter, and said, "Hey, I'm calling about the application," and they go, "Which one?"
Yeah, that's
and you tell them about it. I don't remember. I've applied for hundreds, and you're like, okay, like, well, that's not got off to a good start.
That's right. That's right. Or 2 weeks ago, they've already accepted another job that they applied for, 2 weeks as well.
Yeah, and look, everybody's out on LinkedIn bagging recruiters and bagging the system, but they're equally to blame, right, for how shit it is, because they partake in it. And I remember, Trisha, when I started my recruitment career, you had one opportunity to advertise, right, or two opportunities. One was in the job center in a window, right, and the other one was in the local paper on a Thursday evening, right, where they had the job ads, right? And people had to print off a resume, get an envelope, get a stamp, right? Or they'd come walking in off the street, handing in a resume, right? Which is how I kind of started my career in recruitment.
Old.
Right. But look, the kind of reality is, right. And I remember when we went, and everybody said, "Oh, as soon as we went to job boards and online applications, you guys aren't going to be needed." And we became more important, because all of a sudden my clients started advertise direct and got like 10,000 applications from people all over the world, right? And we're like, how are we going to handle all of this response? Right. And so, what we've seen is that, technology has only amplified how inefficient the whole kind of process was, right? And it's not changed any. And so, look, I think, to your point at the beginning, like, we're not going to get rid of resumes, right? We can't fight that. But what we can do is we can game the system to work to our advantage. And a lot of that means, how do you kind of bypass the steps that are inefficient, right? And the steps that are inefficient is seeing a job online, applying for it along with 5,000 other people, and hoping and praying that the right person sees what and most of the time, like, resumes don't even articulate the value proposition, right?
That agree. Yeah, they just list what they did on a day-to-day basis. I want to come to something, and if you want to wrap up, no worries. Do you think that by only accepting people, hang on, let me take a step back. Being digital obviously opens the world up to a multicultural or multi-dimensional talent workforce. So, for example, in fintech, maybe if Nigeria or Vietnam have got high adoption of Bitcoin, blockchain, these sorts of emerging technologies, even though they've been around for a long time, talent is actually accessible in that region that potentially we've never had access to before. And obviously English as well, Nigeria, it's certainly not a problem. My question though is, obviously your network doesn't usually extend to those third world countries. Does that mean that the right bum in the seat is not there?
Actually, we've and I encourage, and I've got a partnership with a business that actually hires engineering development talent in India, right? I've been a big advocate of regions such as Vietnam, Ukraine, right? Like Eastern Europe, Eastern Bloc, right? Like for engineering talent, that if you can access those people, then you should be accessing them, right? And I think, look, there's some challenges, right? And I think this is why one of the reasons I've got the partnership with a company called Petona is, some of the issues have been around people actually taking on that work and not actually doing it and farming it out to others, right? So you kind of there's some kind of risks to it, but I think ultimately, look, that's something that I'm a massive advocate of.
Yeah.
If you think, and I use this with my clients, like your business is possible because of the smartphone and because now you can access customers anywhere in the world 24/7,
Yeah.
right, at low cost.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
if you're getting excited about being able to go global with customers because of this technology, why are you not excited about accessing a global talent pool who
Yeah.
actually has many of the skills and could be more advanced and has actually done what you need to do, right? Because
Right.
what you
Yeah.
find with it, with innovation, right, is that, yeah, in your industry, you might be doing something cutting edge, but other industries might have already done it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And for one third or fraction of the price, unfortunately for them, they're very undervalued at times. I work with guys in Nepal and they're charging me
Yeah,
nothing, minuscule amounts for
yeah,
someone where I'd have to charge here extortionate. So
yeah,
yeah, and I guess it's just a willingness of Australians to accept or to explore those other avenues, despite being,
yeah.
geographically so far.
Look, if there's a criticism that I've got of Australia, right, in my recruitment career, and this stems back from 2004 when I first arrived here, and it really hasn't changed much, is they place way too much importance on Australian experience, and also, kind of, to me, it's such a paradox, right? Like, if you're looking to innovate and do things differently, why then you're hiring somebody who's done exactly the same job at one of your competitors, who's doing exactly the same stuff that you're doing, right?
Or
It
innovation.
doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And look, the reason for it, I understand the reason for it, right? Like, and this is one thing that I would say to people to really remember when you're job hunting, right? People do not hire on potential. They hire on risk reduction, right? So whoever
Like this.
poses the least amount of risk to their job is who will get hired, right? And
Can
this whole
you
cynic
example?
thing of, you don't hire, you don't hire on, skills, you hire on character or whatever, is utter rubbish, right? I have never seen anybody ever hire somebody on character. It kind of reminds me of, that the TV show, The Office, the UK version. And at the end of the first ever episode, the guy says, yeah, David Brent goes, yeah, I remember a guy, he arrived from Greece, couldn't speak a word of English, but I saw the potential in him. Yeah. And I gave him a job. Didn't work out in the end. He was rubbish. Right. And I think kind of, unfortunately, as hiring managers, we all like to think that we've got this kind of innate ability to spot talent. And yeah, we know, right? It's doesn't work out that way. Right. And so I think, what you have to do as when you're looking for a job is to get really pragmatic and go, okay, right, what kind of risks am I posing? And a good example I would say here, Trisha, is, the classic where somebody's lost their job and they're applying for stuff that's overqualified, and they can't understand that people don't see that as a great kind of transaction for them, that they're getting somebody that's overqualified at a reduced salary.
Yeah.
And the reality of the situation is that, look, one, there are people who are actually better qualified for the job that, are going to get more kind of development out of it. Two, you're then going to pose a threat to me, right? And how am I going to keep you satisfied doing your job? And it's going to be harder work than it's actually, to keep you just doing, work that you've already done. And then three, I think, is that, you kind of, the risk to the culture is that when you bring in people who, are disengaged, that affects then the whole culture, right? And so once people are thinking of it from their perspective and thinking this is a great deal, I can't understand why, they often struggle to kind of put themselves back into the same position that they were in when they were in a job and they had the same decision to make, right? And I think you kind of got to just put that empathy into who's making the hiring decision, if I was in their position, what would be important to me? Not me in my position needing a job, but to them, what would be important to them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Amazing. I would like to finish up and maybe, wrap this up and leading into interviews. So you mentioned about talent and, we can't just identify it immediately. So how far does one go from your experience in the interview process to be able to find out of these shortlisted candidates, this person is qualified but talented to excel in the role?
So one word, transparency, right? And I think the biggest issue that I see with the interview process is that it's full of bullshit, right? You got two sides telling each other what they want to hear, right?
Yeah.
And I go back to when I met my wife and we went on a first date. She wasn't sat there with a clipboard of questions saying, "So Dexter, when have you split up with the next?" Right? How did you respond? If you found out next lover was cheating on you, how did it make you feel at the time? Right? How much do you earn? Can I get names and contact numbers of two of your exes so I can find out that you're not a psycho? And by the way, if I'm interested, we'll do this again and I'll bring along my mum and we'll ask you the same questions again. And at the end of it, let's move in together, right? You'd be like, there's no way I'm going on a second date, right? But that's the interview process. So what I mean by transparency is that if you can share with people exactly what the situation is, the problem that you want them to solve, what resources they'll have available to solve that, right? What your expectations are around time, right? And like 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, what you'd like to see them achieve on that timeline. Nearly everybody, right? If they don't feel that they're capable of doing it, will select themselves out of the process and say, thanks for thinking of me. This isn't the right opportunity, right?
Yeah.
The ones who are absolutely confident, and they're confident because they've done it and they can see that they can build something together with you, will be so engaged, right, that the process will be seamless, right? Because what you're going to be doing through that process is talking about how you're going to actually create this together, not interrogating each other, not making each other feel like uncomfortable and like crap, but actually forging and starting to build a relationship, right? And work is about relationships. That's why we've got massive levels of mental health issues at the minute, because we're not having relationships. We're sitting at our desks, Zooming and Slack and on Slack. And the only community that we have now, used to be neighborhoods. We don't really have those anymore, unless you live in kind of, where I do, which is, out of big metropolitan areas. And so, people, the only community that they've had is work. And now that's been taken away as well, right? And so the importance of relationships, I think we've kind of really forgotten that that's what creates the success, right? Like, the skills and all that stuff, but that stuff's easy to figure out, right? Like the kind of key is, how do you have relationships?
Yeah, I love it. Absolutely fantastic. Well, I think that's the perfect note to leave it there, because that's a really piece of sound advice, and I would certainly love to catch up.
I just got one last thing to say on that, right? People complaining about a 5-stage interview process are looking at this the wrong way, right?
Okay.
Imagine using that dating analogy, right? You need to have time to get to understand whether this is the right opportunity. Look, and if you invest, 5 interviews and you find out that it's not, that's better than investing time in 2 interviews and spending 12 months stressed because you made the wrong decision and worrying about how it's going to impact your career and all of the stuff that it does to your health and everything else.
Right.
So I would encourage people that, if you're being asked to do a 5-stage interview, kind of embrace that as a positive and use it as, how do I get to understand whether these are the right people, right? And if they're not being transparent, withdraw, right? Like it's like, take control.
I think that brings down it to having lower turnover rates, because they've selected the right person that actually wants to make a difference and can see a strategic plan, and long foresighted change, rather than just a 12-month paycheck or, just to get a job. Potentially, a GCC region is a little bit different comparison to Australia, which is why I think that there's a lot of change that could happen, because organizations, startups are paying huge costs as a result of this, the wrong mindset from an employee and an employer perspective to get a bum in a seat. So yeah, there'll be a lot of longevity.
Yeah, you see, I think you see that transactional nature, right, in regions like Singapore as well. Where I think they and it's that will change over time, right, and that will evolve, particularly with these types of businesses, right, where it's getting harder and harder, right, and the window is getting shorter and shorter to actually be successful. And I think you kind of have to just take the time. And I think this is fundamentally what you've touched upon there, Trisha, is the number one reason why there's a perceived talent shortage or why hiring is so difficult. And the reason is people don't take the time up front, right? 100%. They just get a job spec, right? It's like 5 years old, the last person that left, give it out to recruiters, get the problems off my desk, and it's not. You have to invest that time in the process. And it's why we go through that process I mentioned, right? And 50% of the time, the client didn't need to hire. Now, you think the amount of jobs that are out there being posted by recruiters because they've been given a call or an email to say, we've got a job vacancy. Yeah, great. Send me the job spec. I'll see who we've got available, right? And 5 other recruiters are doing the same thing. And then after, 4 weeks of sending resumes and not hearing anything, the client then says, oh yeah, we actually found someone internally, right? You think of the number of jobs that are out there that actually don't really exist.
Yeah.
And people are applying for them.
Yeah, and this can maybe be a conversation for a later stage, but this is where the model of recruitment, traditionally you're paid post placement.
Yeah.
So therefore, from the recruitment side, your time and efforts is lost business, whereas the model can therefore be pivoted to a retainment fee, etc.
Yeah. Look, it's a great model in a talent short market, but I don't think we're going to be in that market for a few years.
Absolutely agree with you. Absolutely. Dexter, I've loved this chat. Honestly, you've been really
fantastic, Trisha.
It would be nearly 1 hour, so we could certainly make a Joe Rogan 3-hour chat. Thank you so much. Let's keep connected, and all the